They mocked him for his skin, laughed at him in hallways, told him he'd never be anything. He sat in silence, day after day, absorbing every insult like bricks on his back. But what they didn't know was that he was building something. Years later, the same voices that tore him down walked into his office, asking for a job. In the industrial edges of Fairfield, a small working-class town laced with the scent of metal and machine oil, lived a boy whose skin invited the world's worst assumptions. His name was Jalen Carter. He was 12 years old, and already the weight of being different had started to harden around his shoulders like armor, forged from years of quiet endurance. Jalen walked the halls of Fairfield Middle School like a shadow, always present, never acknowledged with kindness. He wore hand-me-down shoes that squeaked slightly on the tile floors, and his notebooks were always folded at the corners, clutched tightly as if they held the last pieces of his worth. His skin was dark, darker than most of his peers, and in this school, that was all it took to become a target. Each day brought a new cruelty. Children jeered as he passed, casting words meant to bruise deeper than fists. They laughed about the color of his skin, comparing it to objects meant to degrade. They passed notes about his nose, his lips, his hair, spreading them in a way that wasn't just childish teasing, but a reflection of something they had learned from the world around them. Jalen didn't know where they had learned such hate, but he felt it sharpened by repetition. In class, he was often overlooked. Teachers never called on him, unless it was to reprimand. When he raised his hand, it floated unnoticed. When he lowered his gaze, they assumed he wasn't paying attention. Even when he scored high on tests, the surprise in their tone betrayed an expectation of failure. He wasn't seen as intelligent. He wasn't seen as creative. He wasn't really seen at all. Outside school, things weren't much different. The kids in the neighborhood rarely invited him to play. Their parents rarely made eye contact. He noticed how shopkeepers watched him more closely than other boys his age. He noticed how pedestrians clutched their bags when he passed, even when he wore his church clothes. These small moments, piled together, built a quiet mountain of shame in his chest. He had never done anything to deserve it, but it came anyway, like a storm that never stopped raining. At home, his mother worked 2 jobs and still found time to keep the lights on, the house clean, and the meals warm. She loved him in a way that tried to mend what the world had broken. But even her arms wrapped tightly around him after a hard day couldn't completely keep out the sting of the world's rejection. She taught him pride, but the world taught him shame faster. By the time Jalen was 13, he had stopped talking much in class. He scribbled answers in silence and sat in the back of the room whenever he could. The mocking never stopped, but he gave them fewer pieces of himself to use. He retreated inward, building a fortress of silence and observation. What others missed in his quiet, he used to watch everything. How people moved, how they spoke, how they rose or fell. His notebooks, once filled with doodles and math problems, became filled with plans. He would sketch blueprints for businesses, ideas for new apps, inventions that solved problems no one else cared to see. He didn't always know what to call what he was building, but it gave him a sense of control in a world that constantly tried to take it from him. School guidance counselors marked him down as withdrawn. Teachers wrote reports noting low participation. None of them asked why. None of them wondered what kind of strength it took to come back every single day, knowing that each hour held the potential for another wound. One afternoon, Jalen sat alone in the cafeteria while the others laughed across the room. Someone had thrown a piece of food at him. He didn't flinch, he didn't cry, he simply cleaned the mess and returned to his seat. Inside, a slow fire grew. It wasn't rage, it was determination. These moments weren't going to break him. They were going to build him. In the years that followed, Jalen began to read with a hunger that no school assignment could satisfy. He found books on leadership, wealth, psychology, race, and power. He consumed biographies of men and women who had once been told they were nothing and later shaped the world. He saw himself in those pages, not as he was, but as he could become. As the high school approached, Jalen stayed focused. He didn't chase approval. He chased clarity. He knew who he was, and though the bullying never completely stopped, he learned how to absorb the blows without letting them define him. He still walked the same cracked sidewalks, still wore the same squeaky shoes, but something inside him had changed. They had bullied him for his skin. They had laughed at his silence. But what they didn't realize was that they had taught him exactly what he needed to learn: how to rise in a world that never meant to let him climb. And one day, he would climb so high that they would have to look up just to remember who they once pushed down. High school was a larger stage, but the performance remained the same. Jalen Carter stepped through the double doors of Fairfield High with taller hallways, older students, and harsher stares. The boys who used to throw names at him in middle school had grown taller, deeper voiced, and more polished in their cruelty. The teasing wasn't as loud now, but it was sharper, more calculated, and often hidden behind laughter and smirks. They didn't need slurs anymore. They had subtler weapons now. They rolled their eyes when he spoke in class. They pretended not to hear when he contributed to group projects. They shared glances when he walked into the room and fell silent when he sat down. Their rejection wasn't always spoken, but Jalen felt it in his bones. Still, Jalen remained silent. But this silence was no longer a cage. It had become a strategy. He studied more than anyone else, not to impress his teachers but to surpass the expectations that had always been set too low for boys like him. He stayed after school to use the library's old computers and taught himself how to code, how to write resumes, how to study financial markets. He watched online lectures late into the night, while others scrolled and partied and called him weird for being alone. They thought they were winning. They thought he was shrinking. But he was sharpening. The cafeteria remained a place of exile. Jalen usually ate alone, reading articles or typing into a beat-up tablet someone had donated to the school. He rarely looked up, but he noticed everything. He noticed who had leadership potential, who followed the crowd, and who cracked under pressure. He was learning human behavior without needing a single conversation. The years of being ignored had trained him to see what most people missed. His academic performance soared, but awards rarely followed. The school's recognition seemed to gravitate toward the familiar faces, the same students whose parents had alumni plaques hanging on the walls. But Jalen didn't care about plaques. He cared about progress. He started a blog under a fake name, sharing ideas about perseverance, growth, and the hidden power of those underestimated. His following grew slowly but steadily. He wasn't just writing for himself anymore. He was writing for every kid sitting alone at lunch, wondering if silence would ever become strength. By senior year, he had built a small side business fixing and flipping second-hand laptops and phones. He saved every dollar, investing part of it into online courses and micro-investment apps. He didn't tell anyone. Not because he was hiding, but because he had learned early on that people only supported dreams they could understand. And no one in Fairfield had ever imagined a boy like Jalen dreaming this big. College applications came and went. Counselors gently pushed him toward local community colleges. They didn't believe he could do more. But he had already been accepted to a top-tier university, full scholarship. He didn't announce it at graduation. He didn't pose with balloons or post about it online. He simply left. Fairfield forgot him, but he never forgot Fairfield. College was different. He was no longer the only black face in the classroom. He met others who had carried the same invisible wounds. They spoke with fire, wore confidence like armor, and celebrated their identities unapologetically. Jalen, who had been made to feel too dark, too different, too invisible, now saw his skin reflected with pride in the mirror of his peers. He majored in business and computer science. But his education was bigger than a degree. He met mentors who pushed him to see beyond survival. He joined startup incubators, pitched bold ideas, failed, rebuilt, failed again, and learned. He interned for companies that didn't expect someone like him to outshine their own legacy hires. And yet he did. By 22, Jalen launched a tech platform aimed at helping underrepresented youth gain access to remote internships and startup skills. He called it Skyward, a name born from all those days he spent staring out the school windows, wondering what existed beyond Fairfield. Skyward took off. At first, it grew quietly, just like Jalen had, but soon investors took notice. His user base exploded. Articles were written, panels were offered, and suddenly the boy who once ate alone in silence was being quoted in national publications about tech, leadership, and equity. He built a company with a culture that valued inclusion, not as a buzzword, but as its foundation. He hired former outcasts, self-taught coders, and creative thinkers who had been rejected by the traditional mold. And as the company grew, so did his resolve to return, not to Fairfield High, but to the town that had forged him through fire. Years later, when Skyward opened its second headquarters, Jalen chose Fairfield. The announcement stunned the town. Job postings flooded in. Old classmates whispered in disbelief. The tech prodigy making headlines? That was Jalen? The kid they ignored? The one they laughed at? They hadn't noticed him back then. But now, they couldn't ignore him. And soon, many of them would be sitting across from him, resume in hand, hope in their eyes, wondering if he remembered. He did. Every moment. The newly renovated building sat at the edge of downtown Fairfield, where rusted factories once ruled the skyline. Now, sleek glass walls reflected the town's changing face, one that mirrored the man who had once been overlooked, underestimated, and quietly dismissed. Inside that building, Jalen Carter's company, Skyward, pulsed with energy. The office was vibrant, diverse, and alive with purpose. Young professionals moved through open-concept spaces designed for collaboration. On the walls hung framed quotes, some from famous innovators, others from anonymous users of the platform Jalen built. Every piece of the space reflected intention, but nothing was more intentional than the hiring day he had arranged. It was no accident that the recruitment campaign was pushed aggressively throughout Fairfield. Jalen had instructed his team to circulate flyers, job postings, and internship openings across all local platforms, especially in the places where his name would ring familiar. Local schools, the public library, even Fairfield High School's career office. He knew the effect it would have. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was creating opportunity. But within that opportunity, there was an unspoken reckoning waiting to unfold. The applicants arrived in waves, resumes in hand, nerves buzzing beneath their business attire. Among them were faces Jalen hadn't seen in years, but remembered in vivid detail. One by one, they stepped into the conference room. They didn't recognize him at first. Time had reshaped him. He was taller now, lean, with quiet confidence etched into his posture. His skin, once mocked, now gleamed with pride. His suit was crisp, but his presence wasn't showy. He had nothing to prove, and yet everything about him spoke of victory. When his name was announced as the CEO, a subtle stillness took hold of the room. A few jaws shifted, a few glances exchanged. Recognition spread like a slow burn. He was the same boy they had laughed at in hallways, the one who always sat alone at lunch, the one whose skin had been the target of their cruelty. Now, he was their potential employer. He watched them as they readjusted their expressions, some out of discomfort, some out of guilt, and some out of the sudden realization that their past might now sit in the hands of their future. He didn't offer a speech about the past. He didn't call anyone out. Instead, he offered them what they had never offered him: fairness. His interviews were firm but respectful. He looked beyond the resumes. He asked about growth, adaptability, and how they handled failure. He didn't ask them if they remembered who he was. He let their silence speak instead. Among them was a man named Derek, once the loudest voice in the bullying chorus. In middle school, Derek had led the pack, mocking Jalen's skin, calling him slurs with a grin. Now, Derek wore a second-hand blazer, his voice lower, less confident. His resume was average, his experience limited. But Jalen didn't smirk. He didn't mirror the disdain once shown to him. He simply asked Derek about problem-solving and integrity. Derek stumbled through his answers. The swagger was gone. Jalen nodded, took notes, moved on. Not everyone from the past applied, but word spread quickly. The town buzzed with the realization that the boy they'd buried beneath their cruelty had not only survived, but had become someone impossible to ignore. Skyward thrived in Fairfield. Jalen didn't just create jobs, he created transformation. He partnered with local schools to fund computer labs. He offered scholarships to students from marginalized communities. He invited Black professionals from across the country to speak at leadership events held in the very gymnasium where he had once sat invisible. He wasn't interested in being celebrated. He was interested in creating a pipeline of power where previously there had only been barriers. In board meetings, his voice carried weight. Investors listened when he spoke. He had trained himself to be sharp, but not cutting, passionate, but not performative. He had learned how to navigate rooms where people still sometimes saw his skin before his skill, but now they didn't dare say it aloud. What Fairfield had once tried to deny, the world had embraced. Years passed, and Skyward became more than a company. It became a legacy. At one annual staff retreat, Jalen stood on stage and addressed his growing team. Over 200 employees, many from backgrounds like his, some from neighborhoods worse. They looked at him with respect, not fear. They saw in him what he had never been allowed to see in himself as a child: potential, realized. He spoke not about the cruelty of the past, but about the power of perseverance. He didn't mention Fairfield Middle by name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. He ended his speech with a simple truth he had carried since childhood. You are not what they called you. You are what you choose to become. It was that choice, made silently, painfully, consistently, that had brought him here. Not revenge, but rising. Years had passed since Jalen Carter returned to Fairfield. Time had rearranged the town's streets, painted fresh coats over fading buildings, and added new names to store windows. But the core of it all remained familiar. The people walked a little faster now, as if trying to keep up with the changes they never expected. And in the middle of it all stood Skyward's headquarters, its reflective glass towering above the town like a mirror to its past. Jalen had become more than a CEO. He had become a symbol, not for what he had built, but for what he had overcome. Magazine covers featured him as the man who transformed rejection into innovation. Conferences invited him to speak on resilience, on the unspoken costs of childhood erasure, and on what it means to build success without permission. But Jalen never became addicted to the spotlight. He carried himself with a humility that came from knowing the spotlight had once been pointed at him, only to mock. His confidence wasn't loud. It was quiet and carved from years of silence. He didn't need to remind Fairfield of what they had done. They remembered every time they passed his building, every time they typed his name into a search bar, every time their children came home talking about the scholarship from Mr. Carter's foundation. There was a sense of discomfort in some circles, an unease that bloomed in whispers during dinner parties and church meetings. They couldn't reconcile the man they now praised with the boy they had once ridiculed. Some tried to rewrite their own pasts, saying they had always seen something in him. Others avoided the topic altogether, but truth doesn't shrink with time. It sits quietly in rooms, waiting to be acknowledged. Jalen didn't seek that acknowledgement. He didn't need apologies. What he needed, what he had always needed, was room to exist as he was, and now he had more than room. He had reach. One afternoon, a reunion committee from Fairfield High invited him to their 20-year class event. It was the first invitation of its kind. His name was listed not as an alumnus, but as a special guest. The letter was formal, respectful, and filled with admiration. It arrived folded neatly, typed on crisp paper, with careful wording that tiptoed around the memory of who he had once been in their eyes. He accepted, not out of sentimentality, but out of completeness. The story, for him, was no longer about rising above them. It was about standing among them, whole and unshaken. The night of the reunion, the gymnasium was decorated with banners and string lights, the walls lined with yearbook photos and old trophies. Laughter echoed across the room as former classmates reconnected, compared lives, and fumbled through nostalgia. When Jalen entered, the room shifted. Some froze. Others smiled nervously. A few looked away. He moved through the crowd with grace. He offered handshakes. He returned greetings. And he noticed, more than a few of the faces had changed not just with age, but with recognition. Recognition of who he had become, and who they had been. There was no stage, no speech scheduled. But when the crowd gathered later for the opening toast, the host asked him to say a few words. He stood under the soft light, not with pride, but with presence. He spoke not of the past, but of the power of growth. He spoke of how some wounds become wisdom, how silence can become strength, and how the most broken soil often grows the most resilient roots. There was no bitterness in his voice, but there was truth, and it echoed louder than any speech. After the toast, a few approached him quietly. Some admitted their regrets, not in words, but in the heaviness of their eyes. One former classmate, who had often laughed the loudest during those cruel middle school moments, offered a hesitant nod before walking away. It was enough. Jalen didn't need them to rewrite the past. He had already rewritten the future. Back at Skyward, life continued. New hires joined every week. Internships turned into careers, and young black and brown professionals filled spaces they had once been told were unreachable. Jalen made sure they never felt the way he had felt. He made sure no one ate lunch alone unless they wanted to. He made sure everyone's voice had a place to land. The mural in the main lobby became a quiet centerpiece. It depicted a young boy, sitting at a lunch table alone, his face obscured in shadow. Behind him, rising like light, were the words, "They called me a problem before they ever gave me a chance." Beneath the mural, there was no signature, but everyone knew who the words belonged to. Jalen walked past it every morning, not to remember pain, but to honor the path that pain had cleared. He hadn't just become their boss. He had become a builder of something they never imagined he'd touch, legacy. And while they spent years trying to make him smaller, he had spent years becoming exactly what they could never deny: unbreakable.